To them, he was just an old man, a ghost in a worn coat, clutching a small, polished box as if it held the last breath of a dying star. The polished marble floors of the auction house reflected a world he didn't belong to, a universe of glittering chandeliers and whispered fortunes. A young, sharp-suited security guard, barely a man, stepped his path, his hand raised not in greeting, but as a barrier. "I'm going to have to ask you to move along, sir," the guard said, his voice a carefully calibrated mix of artificial politeness and genuine disdain. "This is a private event." The old man, Arthur, didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the guard with eyes that had seen the turn of seasons 60 times or more, eyes that held a quiet weight the guard could never comprehend. He offered a simple, factual statement, his voice raspy from disuse. "I have a donation." The guard's lips curled into a smirk, a flash of youthful arrogance that was as bright and as cold as the diamonds on the patron's wrists. He glanced at the simple wooden box in Arthur's hands. "Right, a donation. Sir, the minimum lot value here is higher than the car you probably drove in. Now, please, don't make a scene." They saw a stooped figure, a relic of a bygone era, his hands stained with what they assumed was dirt, but what was truly the ghost of oil and steel, of countless hours spent hunched over a workbench. They saw frayed cuffs and scuffed shoes. They saw poverty. They saw insignificance. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess, was the identity of the man they were so casually dismissing. They didn't know that the hands they saw as feeble had once crafted miracles of precision, mechanisms so vital they had saved lives and pushed the boundaries of human exploration. They were about to make a mistake that would echo in the silent, gilded halls of that building for years to come, a lesson in humility delivered not by the old man, but by the legacy he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The world is full of quiet heroes, men and women who walk among us, their greatness hidden beneath a cloak of humility. They don't seek applause. They don't ask for recognition. But sometimes a moment arrives when their silence is broken, and the world is forced to see the giants they truly are. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the stories of these hidden legends. If you believe that true honor is measured not in wealth, but in quiet dignity, make sure to subscribe and press the bell icon so you never miss these inspirational stories. Today, we delve into the story of a father, a gift, and a past that refused to stay buried. A past that was about to be revealed in the most dramatic way imaginable, proving that you should never, ever judge a man by the coat he wears. The weight of disrespect was a familiar burden, one Arthur had carried for so long it felt like a part of his own skeleton. He stood his ground, not with aggression, but with the silent, immovable patience of a mountain. He had faced down far worse than an arrogant boy in a cheap suit. He had wrestled with tolerances measured in microns, with the unforgiving laws of physics, with the relentless ticking of time itself. This was nothing, but the scene was already drawing attention. The hushed conversations of the wealthy patrons began to falter, their eyes, like those of curious magpies, drawn to the small, uncomfortable disturbance in their glittering nest. Welcome back. Before the confrontation, before the polished box and the cold marble floor, there was silence. Arthur's life was a symphony of quiet moments, conducted in a small, cluttered workshop that smelled of mineral oil, old wood, and ozone. Dust motes danced like tiny constellations in the single beam of afternoon light that pierced the gloom, illuminating a world of intricate machinery and forgotten time. Here, he was not an old man to be dismissed, but a master in his element. His kingdom was one of tiny gears, of hairsprings finer than a spider's silk, of escapements that ticked with the gentle heartbeat of a sleeping bird. For 40 years, he had been a horologist, a watchmaker, but that title was a pale shadow of the truth, a simple label for a craft he had elevated to an art form, and then, for a time, to something far more significant. His apartment above the shop was as humble as his life. A single bed, a small kitchen, a worn armchair where he would sit for hours, staring at the city lights, a ghost in his own life. He lived on a modest pension, his needs few, his wants even fewer. He was a man who had mastered the art of being invisible, of asking for nothing and expecting even less. This quiet existence was a world away from the life of his only son, Michael. Michael was a product of a different era, a titan of the digital age. He was the CEO of a successful tech firm, a man who lived in a glass tower, who spoke in terms of acquisitions and market shares, whose time was measured not in the gentle ticking of gears, but in the relentless, unforgiving pulse of fiber optics. He loved his father, in his own way, but it was a distant, abstract love, a love expressed through quarterly phone calls and expensive, impersonal gifts. He saw his father's humble life not as a choice, but as a failure, a gentle tragedy he hoped to correct with infusions of money. He didn't understand that for Arthur, simplicity was the ultimate luxury. On the morning of his 75th birthday, a courier had arrived with a heavy, impeccably wrapped package. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was a watch. But it wasn't just any watch. It was a celestial tourbillon Mark V, a marvel of modern engineering, a symphony of platinum and sapphire that was less a timepiece and more a statement. A statement of wealth, of status, of everything Arthur had spent his life ignoring. A small, embossed card read, "Happy birthday, Dad. Now you have a watch that's worthy of you. Love, Michael." Arthur had stared at it for a long time. The craftsmanship was undeniable, a cold, perfect machine. But it lacked a soul. It was a product of a computer, of a sterile lab. It had none of the warmth, none of the life, that he poured into his own creations. And the phrase, "worthy of you," had struck a dissonant chord. Michael saw his worth in what he could own, not in who he was. Arthur knew then exactly what he had to do. He couldn't wear this monument to a life he didn't lead. But its value, the absurd price tag that Michael had undoubtedly paid, could be transformed. It could be turned into something meaningful. It could fund the scholarship he had always dreamed of creating for young, aspiring artisans, for the next generation of hands that would build, not just assemble. So he had put on his best coat, the worn but clean tweed he saved for special occasions, placed the watch back in its polished box, and taken the bus downtown to the city's most prestigious auction house, which was hosting a major philanthropic gala that very evening. He was prepared for the condescension. He had anticipated the dismissive glances. He was a man accustomed to being underestimated. The auction house was a cathedral of opulence, and Arthur was a pilgrim from a forgotten faith. He stood in the grand foyer, a small, gray island in a sea of black ties and sequin gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulation. The security guard's words still hung in the air, a tiny, poisoned dart. Don't make a scene. But a scene was exactly what was beginning to brew. The manager of the auction house, a man named Julian Croft, was gliding through the crowd, his smile as polished and as brittle as a porcelain veneer. He saw the disturbance at the entrance, his eyes narrowing as he took in the tableau. His immaculate, uniformed guard and the shabby old man who was clearly out of place. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark, sensing blood in the water. "Is there a problem here, Daniel?" Julian asked, his voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of steel. He didn't look at Arthur, a deliberate act of erasure. The guard, Daniel, puffed out his chest, emboldened by his superior's arrival. "This gentleman was just leaving," he said, placing a firm hand on Arthur's shoulder. "He seems to be a little confused." Arthur did not flinch. He did not move. He simply held the box a little tighter. "I am not confused," he stated, his voice quiet but clear. "I am here to donate this item for the Children's Hospital fundraiser." He held out the box. Julian Croft finally deigned to look at it. He took it from Arthur's hands with the tips of his fingers, as if it were a soiled object. He opened the lid. For a moment, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face as he saw the celestial tourbillon. It was a watch he knew well. One had sold at a sister auction house for a staggering sum just months before. But the surprise quickly curdled into suspicion. He looked from the impossibly expensive watch back to the impossibly poor man who held it. The two things did not compute in his world of neat, predictable hierarchies. "This is a joke, right?" Julian said with a short, ugly laugh. "Where did you get this? Did you find it? Did you steal it?" The accusation, spoken so casually, sucked the air out of the immediate vicinity. The nearby patrons fell silent, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. This was better than the art. This was drama. Arthur's face remained a mask of calm, but deep, weary sadness entered his eyes. "It was a gift," he said, "From my son." "Your son," Julian scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "And who would your son be? The King of England?" He snapped the box shut and thrust it back at Arthur. "Listen to me, old man. I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but you've chosen the wrong place. We have a reputation to maintain. We don't accept donations from people like you. Now get out, before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and attempted fraud." This was the moment, the public humiliation, the absolute dismissal of his character, his dignity, his truth. He was being judged on the surface, on the worn fabric of his coat and the lines on his face. He was being weighed and found wanting by a man who couldn't see past the shine of a dollar sign. Arthur simply stood there, his silence more profound than any shout. He had offered a piece of his son's world, hoping to turn it into a piece of his own, and it had been thrown back in his face. The scene was set. The antagonists had played their part. The hero was cornered, his honor questioned in front of the very people he had sought to help. And in the corner of the room, a young intern, a girl named Sarah who was working her first gala, watched it all unfold, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. There was something about the old man's stillness, his profound and unshakable dignity in the face of such scorn. That didn't make sense. The manager's threat hung in the air, sharp and ugly. "I will call the police." Julian Croft was a man who enjoyed the small tyrannies his position afforded him. Humiliating this old man was a sport, a way to reassert his own authority in a world that constantly reminded him he was merely a gatekeeper for the truly wealthy. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen with theatrical menace. The crowd of onlookers had now grown, forming a loose, silent circle around the confrontation. They were a Greek chorus of the privileged, their faces betraying a mixture of pity, contempt, and the mild titillation that comes from witnessing someone else's misfortune. The disrespect was escalating, becoming a public spectacle. "You see," Julian said, his voice now projecting to the captivated audience. "He doesn't even deny it. He just stands there. What have you got to say for yourself? Old man, cat got your tongue." Arthur remained silent. To explain would be to grant Julian a power he didn't deserve. To defend himself would be to accept the premise of the accusation. His dignity was a fortress, and its walls were built of silence. He had lived a life where action spoke louder than words, where the quality of one's work was the only testimony that mattered. He would not start begging to be believed now. The young intern, Sarah, felt a growing sense of wrongness. While everyone else saw a vagrant, she saw something different. She was a student of art history, trained to look for details others missed. She noticed the old man's hands. They weren't just dirty. They were the hands of a creator. The fingernails were clean, but the cuticles and the deeper lines of the skin were permanently ingrained with the dark patina of machine oil and metal polish. They were the hands of a craftsman, like the ones she'd seen in photographs of old-world artisans. And then she saw it. As Arthur shifted his stance, the worn sleeve of his tweed coat rolled up his wrist by a fraction of an inch. There, on the weathered skin of his forearm, was a tattoo. It was faded, the lines blurred by age, a pale blue-gray ghost on his skin. It wasn't a skull or an anchor or any of the common designs she knew. It was a complex, intricate symbol, a gear, a perfect escapement wheel, encircled by a laurel wreath and a crown. It was an emblem of some kind, a mark of distinction. It looked less like a sailor's tattoo and more like a coat of arms for a forgotten guild. It was a clue, a tiny detail that contradicted the entire narrative of the man Julian Croft was painting. It spoke of pride, a belonging, of mastery. Sarah felt a surge of courage. She took a tentative step forward. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "perhaps we should just verify the watch's serial number? We could do it discreetly." Julian shot her a look of pure venom. "Discreetly? Young lady, you are an intern. Your job is to be invisible and fetch champagne, not interrupt me. Do you understand?" He turned his back on her, a final, brutal dismissal. He looked back at Arthur, his patience clearly at its end. "Last chance. Walk out that door, or the next people you speak to will be in uniform." The sound of his finger tapping the screen of his phone was loud in the tense silence. It was then that the main doors of the auction house swung open, a gust of cold night air sweeping through the warm, stagnant room. The arrival was not loud or ostentatious, but it had an immediate and profound effect on the atmosphere. The hum of the crowd didn't just quiet. It ceased to exist. All heads turned, not with the casual curiosity they had shown Arthur, but with collective, instinctive deference. An undeniable presence had entered the room, a center of gravity that bent the light and sound around it. The man who entered was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored evening suit, but it wasn't his suit that commanded the room's attention. It was his aura. He carried himself with an air of quiet, absolute authority that made Julian Croft's performative power seem like a child's game. He had silver hair, a lined, intelligent face, and eyes that seemed to take in the entire room, and everyone in it, in a single, sweeping glance. He was Sir Reginald Vance, a world-renowned physicist, a philanthropist whose donations dwarfed the entire net worth of most of the patrons in the room, and, most importantly for our story, a passionate collector of horological masterpieces. He was the evening's guest of honor. His gaze passed over the fawning faces, the glittering jewelry, the expensive art on the walls, and then it stopped. It stopped on the small, tense drama unfolding by the entrance. He saw Julian Croft, puffed up with self-importance. He saw the circle of spectators. And then he saw the old man at the center of it all, standing with the quiet resilience of an ancient tree. Sir Reginald's expression, initially one of polite interest, shifted. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief followed by a dawning wave of profound, unmistakable recognition. He ignored Julian Croft's sycophantic greeting as he began to move forward. He walked directly toward Arthur, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted before him, as if by an invisible force. He stopped a few feet from Arthur, his eyes not on the old man's face, but on his hands and on the small, worn leather pouch Arthur used to carry his tools, which was peeking out of his coat pocket. On that pouch was the same faded crest that was tattooed on his arm. The escapement wielded the laurel, the crown. Sir Reginald's breath caught in his throat. The silence in the room was now absolute. It was a heavy, sacred silence, filled with the unspoken question. What was happening? Julian Croft, utterly bewildered by this turn of events, tried to interject. Sir Reginald, a pleasure to have you. I was just dealing with a minor security issue. Sir Reginald did not even glance at him. He raised a hand, a simple, commanding gesture that cut Julian off instantly. He kept his eyes fixed on Arthur, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with reverence that stunned the onlookers into utter stillness. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice resonating with awe. "I thought you had disappeared. We searched, the whole world searched for you after the Apollo missions." He took another step closer, his gaze lifting to meet Arthur's eyes. The old man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was a confirmation, a silent admission that, yes, he was who Sir Reginald thought he was. The great physicist's face was now a canvas of emotion, awe, respect, and a deep, profound gratitude. He turned to face the bewildered crowd, his voice now ringing with the authority of a king addressing his court. "Do you people have any idea who you are looking at?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. The reveal had begun, the moment that would shatter the arrogant ignorance of everyone in the room. The quiet hero's long silence was about to be broken, not by his own words, but by the thundering testimony of a man who understood his true worth. The air crackled with anticipation. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The king had arrived, not to be honored, but to honor the humble man everyone else had dismissed as a beggar. Sir Reginald Vance held the attention of every single person in that hall. His gaze swept over them, and for the first time, many of the wealthy patrons felt small, judged not for their lack of wealth, but for their lack of perception. "You see an old man in a worn coat," Sir Reginald began, his voice resonating with dramatic, quiet power that made Julian Croft shrink. "I see a legend. I see a ghost. I see the man who saved the moon landing." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The statement was so audacious, so utterly unbelievable, that it sounded like madness. Julian Croft let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. "Sir Reginald, with all due respect, I think you must be mistaken. This man is a nobody. He was trying to pass off a stolen watch. Sir Reginald's eyes flashed with a cold fire. He turned his gaze upon Julian, and the manager visibly flinched. "A stolen watch," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "This man has no need for a watch like that, you ignorant fool, because he is the one who taught the world how to make time stand still." He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising to fill the great hall. "This is Arthur Chadwick. And for those of you whose history is limited to the fluctuations of the stock market, allow me to enlighten you. In the 1960s, NASA was facing a crisis. The chronometers for the Apollo program were failing under the extreme conditions of space. They were losing microseconds, and in a lunar landing, a microsecond can be the difference between a triumphant step for mankind and a crater on the moon's surface. The greatest minds at MIT at Caltech were stumped. The Swiss watchmaking giants said it was impossible. The project was on the verge of collapse." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then pointed a trembling, reverent finger at Arthur. Then they found him, a quiet, unassuming watchmaker from a family of artisans, working in a small, dusty shop that his father had left him. A man with no university degree, no corporate backing, just hands that could understand the soul of a machine. They brought him an impossible problem, and he gave him a miracle. Sir Reginald walked over to Arthur, and to the astonishment of everyone present, he took Arthur's worn, oil-stained hands in his own. This man with these hands, designed and built by himself, the Chadwick escapement, a mechanism so perfectly balanced, so resilient, it was a revolution. It didn't just keep time, it defied chaos. It was a piece of mechanical poetry that could withstand the G-forces of launch in the vacuum of space, and it never, ever lost a single beat. The Chadwick escapement was a heart that beat inside the Apollo missions. It's the reason Neil Armstrong's one small step was timed to perfection. It is not an exaggeration to say that the success of that historic moment rested on the genius of the man you see standing before you. The silence that followed was deafening. The truth, so immense and so unexpected, was like a physical blow. The patrons stared at Arthur, no longer seeing a vagrant, but a figure of immense historical importance. Sarah, the intern, felt tears welling in her eyes, her initial intuition vindicated in the most spectacular fashion. Julian Croft's face had turned a pale, sickly white. His world, built on shallow judgments of appearance and wealth, had crumbled to dust at his feet. Sir Reginald wasn't finished. His voice softened, now filled with a deep, personal sadness. And what did he ask for in return? Nothing. No fame. No fortune. He refused all patents, stating that his work belonged to humanity. He asked for only one thing: to remain anonymous. He wanted no part in the parades, the medals, the ceremonies. When the world was celebrating, he was back in his workshop, fixing grandfather clocks. He disappeared from the history books because he chose to. He is the quietest of all our quiet heroes. He finally released Arthur's hands and looked directly at Julian. "So you see, when you accuse this man of stealing a watch, you are not just insulting a blameless individual. You are desecrating a national treasure." The aftermath of Sir Reginald's revelation was a tidal wave of shame that washed over the entire room. The patrons, who moments before had been watching with detached amusement, now could not meet Arthur's gaze. Their casual cruelty was laid bare, and the reflection was hideous. They saw themselves in Julian Croft, in his smug certainty and his shallow judgments. They were all complicit. Julian himself looked as though he had been turned to stone. His face was a mask of horror, the blood having drained from it completely. The phone he had been brandishing so proudly slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the marble floor, the sound echoing the shattering of his career. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. What could he possibly say? How could he apologize for an offense so profound? He had not just insulted a man. He had, as Sir Reginald said, desecrated a living piece of history. The security guard, Daniel, looked even more stricken. He was just a boy, following orders, but the memory of his own condescending words, "Okay, Rambo, don't make a scene," now burned in his mind. He took an involuntary step backward, as if creating distance from his own actions could somehow undo them. He looked at Arthur with a new, terrified reverence, as if the old man might suddenly display some form of superpower. But Arthur displayed nothing. He offered no triumphant smirk, no "I told you so" glare. His expression did not change. He had not sought this vindication, and he took no pleasure in it. The revelation was, for him, a burden. It had dragged him out of the quiet shadows where he had chosen to live, and thrust him into a spotlight he had never desired. His honor was restored, but his peace was shattered. It was then that another figure appeared at the doors, pushing his way through the stunned crowd. It was Michael, Arthur's son. He must have driven at breakneck speed, his face pale and anxious. Sarah, the intern, had found a moment during Sir Reginald's speech to call the number on the gift card, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. Michael skidded to a halt, his expensive suit rumpled, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. The shamed manager, the awestruck crowd, the great Sir Reginald Vance standing beside his father like a royal guard. He had heard the final part of the story, enough to understand the magnitude of what had happened. He looked at his father, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. He didn't see the quiet, slightly disappointing old man who lived above a dusty shop. He saw the hero Sir Reginald had described. He saw the genius, the humble giant, and in that moment, the expensive watch he had sent, the gift he had been so proud of, felt like a cheap, tawdry insult. He had offered a symbol of wealth to a man whose legacy was beyond any price. The falling action was silent. There were no more words to be said. The truth had done its work. The antagonists were vanquished not by force, but by the sheer, undeniable weight of forgotten history. Arthur's honor had been restored by a witness who understood its true measure, and the quiet hero stood, as always, in dignified silence, waiting for the world to pass him by once more. The real reckoning, the one between a father and a son who had never truly known him, was yet to come. Arthur had had enough. He had not come for glory, and he would not stay to receive it. While the room was still reeling, caught in the grip of their collective shame, he turned to leave. He gave Sir Reginald a small, grateful nod, the silent communication of two men who understood things the others in the room never would. He looked at the polished box containing the watch, which Julian had dropped and now lay on the floor. Arthur made no move to retrieve it. It was an object from a world he was finished with. He simply turned and began to walk toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his back straight. He wanted nothing more than the quiet solitude of his workshop, the familiar company of his tools, the gentle, predictable ticking of 100 tiny hearts. "Dad, wait!" Michael's voice was filled with a desperate, newfound urgency. He rushed to his father's side, his face a mess of confusion, shame, and awe. I didn't know," he stammered. "You never said anything." Arthur stopped and looked at his son. He placed a gentle hand on his arm. "There was nothing to say," he said, his voice soft. "The work was what mattered. The rest was just noise." This simple statement held the entire philosophy of Arthur's life. It was a lesson Michael was only just beginning to comprehend. His own life was built on noise, on press releases, on stock prices, on public perception. He had mistaken the noise for the music. Now, in the profound silence of his father's humility, he was finally hearing the melody. He was vindicated, but Arthur remained unchanged. He was the same man who had walked in, a quiet horologist who valued precision and purpose over praise. The events of the evening had not elevated him. They had simply revealed the heights at which he had been living all along. He left the auction house, his son trailing silently behind him, a student following a master he had only just recognized. Sir Reginald watched them go, a sad, respectful smile on his face. He then bent down and picked up the watchbox. He walked over to the podium at the front of the hall, his presence once again commanding silence. "The first donation for the Children's Hospital fundraiser has been made," he announced, his voice booming. He held up the celestial turbillion. "This lot is not for sale. It will be placed in the National Science and Technology Museum, in a new wing dedicated to the forgotten heroes of the space race. But its estimated value, $2 million, will be personally donated by me, in the name of the man who just walked out that door, Arthur Chadwick." The resolution was complete. The antagonists were left to deal with the wreckage of their arrogance. The hero's gift had been made, his honor defended, and his legacy secured for future generations. And he, the quiet hero, was already on his way home, leaving the noise and the glamour behind, seeking the simple, profound peace of a job well done. The narrative had come full circle, leaving behind a powerful lesson. True greatness doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. And sometimes it takes a lifetime to learn how to see it. The world is full of Arthur Chadwicks, and their stories are waiting to be told. All we have to do is learn to look past the surface and listen to the silence. The drive home was a study in silence, but a different kind of silence than the one that usually existed between Arthur and Michael. It was not the silence of distance and misunderstanding, but the silence of reverence and reflection. Michael drove the sleek, electric car, its silent engine a stark contrast to the clatter of his own thoughts. He kept glancing at his father in the passenger seat. The old man was looking out the window, watching the city lights blur past, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. It was as if the extraordinary events of the evening had been nothing more than a minor detour on his way home. Michael was beginning to understand that his father operated on a different frequency, a different time scale. He had spent his life in communion with the steady, reliable rhythm of the universe, while Michael had been caught in the chaotic, frantic static of the modern world. The father was analog, the son was digital, and for the first time, Michael felt the profound limitations of his own binary existence. When they arrived at the small, unassuming building that housed Arthur's workshop and apartment, Michael shut off the car but made no move to get out. "Why, Dad?" he finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you ever tell me? I spent my whole life thinking you were just fixing clocks. I was proud of what I was doing, building my company, and I thought you hadn't achieved anything." The confession was painful but necessary. Arthur turned to look at him, and for the first time, Michael saw not just a father, but a man who had held the fate of astronauts in his hands and had asked for nothing in return. "Michael," Arthur said, his voice gentle but firm, "what you have built is remarkable. You have created jobs for hundreds of people. You have connected the world in new ways. That is a fine legacy. You should be proud of it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "My work was different. It was quiet work. It was supposed to be. Some things are not done for the achievement. They are done because they need to be done. The reward was in the solving of the problem. The parade was a distraction." Michael finally understood. The watch, the expensive gift, had been his way of trying to give his father a taste of his world, the world of status and recognition. He was trying to bestow upon his father a symbol of success, never realizing that his father's success was so immense, so profound, that it required no symbols at all. It was a secret, not because it was shameful, but because it was sacred. The lesson of the night was not about the shaming of an arrogant manager or the vindication of a forgotten hero. It was about a son finally learning the true definition of his father's worth. It was not measured in dollars or headlines, but in the silent, steady beat of a perfectly crafted heart, a heart that had once ticked on the surface of the moon. Michael got out of the car and walked his father to the door of the old building. There, under the dim light of the street lamp, he did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He hugged his father, clinging to him like a lost child who had finally found his way home. Arthur was surprised at first. Then he relaxed and gently patted his son on the back. No words were needed. The gap between their two worlds had finally been closed. As Michael walked back to his car, he looked up at the workshop window, where a single, warm light had just been switched on. He knew his father was back in his kingdom, among his tiny, ticking creations, a master who sought no subjects, a king who needed no crown. The hero was home. The 10th and final part of the story is not about the noise of the climax, but about the echoes it leaves behind. The world, having been reminded of Arthur Chadwick's existence, tried briefly to reclaim him. News vans camped outside his small shop for a day or two. Journalists shouted questions at his window. The museum curator called, wanting to design the exhibit around him, but Arthur, as always, refused the noise. He did not answer the door. He did not pick up the phone. He simply continued his work, and eventually the world, with short attention span, moved on, leaving him to the peace he so cherished. But the echoes of that night changed the lives of those who were there. Julian Croft was quietly and unceremoniously fired. His name became a cautionary tale among the city's elite, a reminder that arrogance is a brittle shield. He lost everything not because he had insulted a hero, but because he revealed his own complete lack of character. His judgment was based only on the superficial, and in a world where true value is often hidden, such a man could not be trusted. The security guard, Daniel, quit his job. He enrolled in a night school history class, driven by a newfound desire to understand the stories that lie hidden beneath the surface of the world. He had learned a hard lesson in humility, one that would make him a better man. And Sarah, the young intern, found her life's calling. Inspired by Arthur's story and Sir Reginald's passion, she changed her major from art history to the history of science and technology. She would go on to become a leading curator, dedicating her career to uncovering and celebrating the stories of other forgotten geniuses, the quiet heroes who had shaped the world from the shadows. She never saw Arthur again, but the image of his steadfast dignity and the faded tattoo on his arm became her guiding star. But the most profound change was in Michael. He did not sell his company or abandon his life, but his perspective was forever altered. He began to visit his father every week, not for a quick, dutiful phone call, but for hours of quiet companionship. He would sit in the workshop, watching his father work, learning about the intricate dance of gears and springs. He learned the value of patience, of precision, of doing something for the love of the work itself. He started the Chadwick Scholarship for Artisan Excellence, funding it himself, ensuring that a new generation of creators would have the chance to pursue their craft without the pressures of fame or fortune. He had finally learned to speak his father's language, the language of quiet, meaningful action. One afternoon, months later, Michael was sitting in the workshop when he noticed his father carefully disassembling the movement of an old, tarnished pocket watch. "What are you doing, Dad?" he asked. Arthur looked up, a rare, gentle smile on his face. He held up a tiny, almost invisible gear. "I am fixing it," he said. "It's a little broken, but it has a good heart. It just needs a little time." Michael realized his father wasn't just talking about the watch. He was talking about him. He was talking about everyone. In a world obsessed with the new, the fast, the shiny, his father had spent a lifetime tending to the old, the slow, the forgotten. He was a restorer of time, of value, of broken things. And in the process, he had restored his own son. The story of Arthur Chadwick reminds us that legacies are not always written in headlines or carved in stone. Sometimes they are etched in the microscopic gears of a machine that takes us to the stars. Sometimes they are found in the quiet dignity of a man who asked for nothing, but who has given us everything. True honor, in the end, is a form of quiet, patient work. What do you think is the most powerful form of legacy? Is it the loud, public achievement, or the quiet, unseen act of dedication? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe and join our community as we continue to shine a light on the world's hidden heroes. Thank you for watching.